Welcome, everyone, to yet another episode of Business Without Anxiety, where we keep talking about generalized anxiety, things that have happened in our lives, things that we are not ready to share yet, thinking that, oh, we are so strong, things where we might have still a stigma or a taboo. We have Coach Inayat Kanji from Ample Therapy, and every week we are picking up a topic that we thought was, oh, something like quite not so good to talk about, but once we started talking there were so many deep issues that we could resolve. That is seen by the kind of questions that are coming from our audience are really participating in understanding how to live a life, run a business, and enjoy life without general anxiety. This is all about general life. Coach Inayat, welcome. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. I'm very well, thank you. Thank you for having me again, once again on your platform, and yeah, looking forward to our discussion.
Amazing. So, we have been picking some topics driven by our audience, and a wonderful topic has come. And on purpose, I use the word wonderful because when I first mentioned this word to Coach Kanji, he said wonderful. And this topic is guilt, especially unwanted guilt. We will talk about guilt and how does it affect our general anxiety, why does it come. We have a question from the audience. What is the difference between guilt and remorse? So we'll try to answer that. So let's get on with things. So, Coach Kanji, how does guilt affect anxiety? That's the bigger question. But let's start with a simpler one. What is guilt and why does it come?
What is guilt and why does it come? So, the emotion of guilt, from my experience, is a form of regret,
Mm-hmm.
in that when one has done an action that later they begin to regret, they start to feel guilt. And that regret could be for many reasons, from regretting their intention to
Mm-hmm.
regretting the emotional impulse to regretting the potential outcomes and consequences, whatever it may
Mm-hmm.
be. It is seemingly that idea that I did something that I wish I had not,
Right.
and therefore one starts to feel guilt for their specific behavior. Doesn't mean necessarily that they have an ethical stance on it. That's a
Mm-hmm.
separate discussion. But just the
Mm-hmm.
feeling that guilt evolves into, and in terms of thoughts, is
Mm-hmm.
as described. That it's a deep feeling of regret, essentially, which is then reflected in patterns of conversation surrounding whatever the action was that one regrets.
And then this goes into actions where we feel down or sad, or we just pause and we respond in three different ways, and mostly the freeze way. We have the fight, flight, or freeze. But when it comes to guilt, many times people just slow down and go into their thinking mode. um, and this is where the low energy starts, that leads to some version of anxiety, like, if I do this, how am I being judged? Am I doing it right? Am I doing it wrong? And
Wow.
as things
I love how
start
you
from
segue
childhood.
there to judgment. Mm.
Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, the first forms of guilt were actually shared from our caregivers, if you see, whether they were parents or teachers or siblings or friends. And we were told, oh, this is right and this is wrong. And if you did this, then these are the consequences. And guilt is actually used in many parts of the society as a method of management, right? Especially for personal situations. But yeah, you are right that it's a form of regret and slowing down of actions and feeling down that makes it worse. And in all our episodes, we have been connecting that anxiety comes when you don't feel safe. You don't feel safe to express yourself. You don't feel safe to be yourself. You don't feel safe when you're by yourself, meaning you might have codependence on others, codependence behaviors, or you need that validation from a caregiver. And if that validation doesn't come, you try to do self people pleasing or something of that kind. And similarly, if guilt and when guilt is actually using that situation for us to not feel safe, goes into anxious moments. What will happen after this? And the brain doesn't feel safe after that. You come from the performing side of things, and I know I listen to uh, a quote from a wonderful actress, and she's a British actress, and she said, "Yes, I do feel guilty, but only on Tuesdays at 11." uh, the reason she mentioned this is what she was trying to say in that workshop is that guilt has its own place, and we will talk about that. But if you keep feeling guilty for a longer period of time, it moves into anxiety, then it moves into freezing, then it moves into body issues, physical issues, then moves into behavior. And that is where things are. You cannot be feeling guilty Monday to Friday and so forth. The purpose of guilt is to show that something was wrong, and the best thing for that would be to fix it, to learn the lesson and correct our actions from it. But if we keep feeling guilty for a longer time, then it starts affecting who we are. And that's what she meant, this actress, that if she has done something wrong, she does feel guilty. She was being sarcastic by saying only on Tuesdays at 11. What she means is after that, she bounces back to being
Mm.
her own self so that she can correct her situation rather than staying in that state. And that staying is the problem more than the guilt. It's like a
Um,
bulb is the indicator. So saying that you turn left or turn right, but you cannot drive by looking at the indicator, right? You have to focus on
yeah,
the road.
yeah. It's a great analogy. It's a great analogy, because yeah, I listened to a podcast from a 103-year-old doctor, and she was describing a similar thing in that she even expressed it a bit more harshly in terms of everyone has a journey, and essentially a lot of the time, people who stay in the emotion of guilt for too long try
Mm-hmm.
to correct the guilt through people pleasing. That makes sense.
Mm.
And essentially, sometimes even, let's say me and you have had an exchange,
Mm-hmm.
and I've said something
Mm-hmm.
which has seemingly made you react. And thereafter, I leave the circumstance or the situation, and I reflect, or somebody else tells me, I think you really upset that person.
Mm-hmm.
And bear in mind, you're a stranger. I don't have the opportunity necessarily to kind of rectify it. Some people ruminate on that so much, the idea, just the idea, right? Let alone if you had the ability to go back in the room and correct it. They ruminate over this factor of why did I express myself that way?
Yeah.
So, like I said about the not necessarily when one does something offensive, it's quite obvious that in expressing that you're sorry for the action directly to the person, asking for forgiveness can remove the guilt, right? But what
Yeah.
happens when you don't have that opportunity, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It is to accept that emotionally at the time, whatever the reason was, that
Yeah.
was my emotional choice and it had its reason in place.
Yeah.
And if one does feel still that regret or that guilt, which now may
Mm-hmm.
be turning into remorse, the sadness then felt thereafter for the action taken, it is the change in behavior in future that to some degree will also remove that further future guilt.
Yeah, yeah. So the two questions showed up here, and one of them is says, "Why do we ruminate?" And the other one says about sometimes guilt feels right. Um, in fact, let me take the first one very quickly. When we are not watching, our brain ruminates, thinking it is trying to solve the problem, thinking it's good, positive work. The brain thinks that we have been taught if you can't solve a problem this way, try another way. And the brain is trying to do that as if it is helpful, but it's not. So it's good to catch ourselves. And sometimes we are feeling good in guilt or rumination and so forth, mainly because we have confused the word good and familiar. What we are
Mm,
actually feeling is familiar, and familiar has a relationship with safety. That is why many people stay in a very unsafe situation because it's more familiar. They are not
yes.
yet ready to take action. It feels safe to them, but that's a false sense of safety. That's a
Mm,
false sense of feeling good, that it feels, oh, if I'm not at all regretful, then I'm a bad person. So I'm
mm,
feeling guilty so that I'm a good person.
mm,
But I mean, coming from life experiences, the best thing you can do for a past so called learning experience, another name for mistake, is to learn and do something about it rather than stay in that state
mm.
thinking I could have done better. And you mentioned
It-
one important thing. Um, and sorry, I interrupted. You were about to say something, but from the previous point you mentioned, sometimes you
mm,
can't do anything about it in the past. Sometimes, I mean, this happens in accidents where there is one survivor, and survivor's guilt is humongous. I mean, and or I want to say something to my dad, and now I can't. And
mm,
people say, what can I do about it? And you used a very powerful word, accept it.
mm. Acceptance is an amazing tool in teaching oneself in these circumstances, right? And moving on. Um, but sometimes the way in which one acquires acceptance um, is one that some people struggle with. Um, as I often say, the conversation you have with yourself is the most important. But until we can master that, sometimes it is just having an outlet to verbalize and action the thought
Right?
that allows us to then let it go, right? And as I say, if thoughts are emotions, it allows us to let go of the emotion. So if one is feeling guilty, so it's interesting. I'll give you an example.
Yeah.
Can't name names, but
Yes.
somebody
Right.
told me something which was a private matter of somebody else's,
Right.
and this juicy information, they
Mm-hmm.
had to share it, right?
Yeah.
And interestingly, I can imagine it in the workplace. This often occurs where one colleague tells another colleague something, maybe about management, or maybe something that is a bit more um, for only a few ears, right? And thereafter, they now feel guilty because they don't have control
Mm-hmm.
over what the other person does with that information, right? So in my
Mm-hmm.
circumstance, that occurred. And so the next day, the person comes to me because they found out I had an interaction with the person they were
Mm-hmm.
speaking about. And
Mm-hmm.
they're eager to find out if I said anything. And they must have asked me about 4 times, like, what did you say? And then what did they say? Really critically analyzing the outcomes and the conversations I'm now having with a third party because of their individual action and impulse. And when given this information, from an emotional standpoint, for whatever reason, and we can analyze and psychoanalyze, but they shared it, right? They shared it with me. There might be some
Yeah.
good intention in it. There might have been some bad intention in it, right?
Hmm.
But it's interesting, rather than processing why they did it and the emotional kind of attachment to the behavior, right? Why did I share this information that I was given in confidence? They went to the projected outcome of I must damage limitation, and the overthinking that must have occurred in the day, in between.
Yeah.
And so I had to reassure the person 10 times over. Firstly, it is irrelevant what I've done, but you should trust me that I'm not that kind of person. But secondly, as I've just described, what really matters is your worry,
Yeah.
your anxiety,
Yeah.
around the fact that you chose to do that behavior. So one has to be more self-aware and reflect, and then action that change in thought, that change in feeling.
Yeah.
That will enable you to let go of this guilt.
Here I have a formula, if or a trick,
Mm.
I would
You
say.
like formulas. You like formulas.
And
Go on.
and there is a question that came, so I'll come to that in a moment. But you use the word "let go,"
Yeah,
and I first tell them, "Let it be." That's it. So "let it be"
I like that.
is more powerful than "let it go," because when you start with "let it go," people have a variety of reasons why they are not letting it go. But when you say "let it be," that actually keeps you on the same plane, saying, "Oh, okay, I am letting it be," and then letting go becomes easier.
I like that. I like that. So it's almost like first start with the consequence, let it be, then that
Let it
enables you
be.
to let go of the emotion.
First start with the existing thing, accept it, let it be. I mean, if that happened, if that person said this, so my image will be tarnished or something, let it be, it's okay. And then when you do let it be, you will see that it was not as bad as you thought, or the brain tries to do worst case analysis. The reason the brain does worst case analysis originally is because if the brain is
Mm,
prepared for the worst, anything below is a good case, right? That's why the
mm,
brain does worst case analysis, but doesn't mean that the worst case is going to come true.
mm, mm, mm,
So it was
mm.
like one of the writers, was it Mark Twain or someone, who mentioned that I had a lot of disasters which never happened. So, so they were all in the head. They never happened.
We've discussed this. Bad movies, right? Bad movies, playing bad
Bad
movies.
movies playing.
Yeah, it's fascinating because I think that's a great way to put it. Because, like I said, emotions are either in or out, and so one
Yeah.
has to let go, right? But sometimes, until one has real deep emotional connection with oneself and works from a
Mm-hmm.
place of present rather than past or future, their
Mm.
thoughts don't always align. However, as you've described, that's a great pragmatic way to approach it, in that first and foremost, accept, let it be the
Mm.
circumstance. And then from there, your emotion will slowly dissipate, let go. Um,
Yeah.
so
You get
yeah,
some energy out
that's
of
very
it.
interesting. Great
The
observation.
question that came a few minutes ago, and I would
Mm,
be curious to hear your answer before I share mine,
go on.
is what's the difference between acceptance and compromise?
Oh, nice question. The difference between acceptance and compromise. Well, right now I have to accept the fact that I'm dealing with natural light, right?
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes it flashes a little bit in and out.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but at the same time, uh, in having that acceptance, do I need to compromise? Do I compromise myself? Is there a difference between the two? In accepting, should I take action in this moment straight away and like change the lighting, pause the set, like let's scrap this Jeev, I've got to fix this first. So
Right.
acceptance and compromise is very interesting, right? Because it depends how you perceive compromise, for
Let's say
starters.
it's with a situation or a person, more than the light side of things. Let's say you are upset with someone.
Hmm.
It's making you feel anxious or stressed. Okay, so one way is to accept
Yeah.
the fact that this is happening. And the second one is you
Yeah.
compromise, saying, oh, okay, that we have this is your opinion and this is my opinion, and we come to this middle ground, and we see something about it. You may not be
I see where
entirely
you're going. I see
happy.
where you're going.
You may
Yeah.
not be entirely happy with the second situation, but yeah. So, what do you think of that? And then I'll share what I was about to share.
Sure. So, okay, so like, why was I giving the example I was giving this? Because ultimately, what I'm saying is that in the moment, you have a choice. You have a choice to either accept, or you have a choice to feel like you have been compromised, right? I have been compromised, right? So that's what I was
Hmm.
saying with the lighting thing, whatever. It's like it's something out of
Yeah,
my control. I either can have
yeah,
acceptance over, or I can feel really compromised, and then I start fighting against it to some degree, internally or externally. So in the same way, like you're saying, this conversational thing. If somebody has had an exchange and they feel their feelings have been compromised,
right.
often it will create that conflict, right, within or externally, right?
Yeah,
However, if one knows themselves
yeah,
and does express themselves authentically,
yeah,
regardless of the emotional response from the other person, they will never feel compromised, right? So again, it's a form of people pleasing again, isn't it? Whereby, and also trying to have too much control over external outcomes,
yeah,
right?
yeah. In
Rather than
fact, you said
accepting
it.
the
You
emotion.
said it in nice ways in three different. So one you mentioned about like how the other person is getting something, and whether you are getting something, and one side is people pleasing or self pleasing or self respect, like you mentioned. One side is you might not be happy with the outcome, or you might be happy with the outcome, but uh, to join all these things, I found from experience and while talking to other people, when you compromise with something or someone, the end goal is less powerful. You don't feel as powerful walking away from that situation because it's a compromise. But when you accept it, you actually still have the power, you still have the energy, because your brain is not spending that much energy in mentally fighting. Sometimes even after the compromise, you carry on the argument inside your head. Right? You compromised externally, but
Yeah,
you haven't
I literally got
accepted
the
it.
thought as you're saying that. I got the thought. Yeah, because I literally got the thought as you said that. It's like replaying the same scene again
Yeah,
and again and again. It's like I
yeah,
finished the scene, I'm going to rewind it again. Finish the scene, I'm going to rewind it again. You're constantly doing
yeah,
that. For what reason? As you
yeah,
say, acceptance is such a more powerful thing. And then
yeah. You
change the
feel
scene,
powerful. Yeah.
right? But I do understand how people can get really locked into it. I'll give a petty example. I played football last night, played
Okay.
amazing with my passing game and other things, but kept
Mm-hmm.
missing chances of scoring. Now,
Mm-hmm.
to one degree, a small
Mm-hmm.
reflection, because people will argue this. What? So should you never ever think about anything that's happened in the moment before? A small reflection for analysis of performance can sometimes benefit, right? Paints new pictures in the mind for the future event, right? I'll do this or I'll change that, etc. But to ruminate, if I spend every day for the next week thinking about this 1 hour of football, right,
Yeah.
it's going to destroy all other further interactions with sport that I have through the week, right? So in the
It
same
will drain
way,
you.
when you're dealing with
So finally,
people,
energy
circumstance,
goes down. Finally, the energy goes down in one situation, and the other situation energy is up.
so I mean, yeah, it's for me like it's been a practice because as I've said to you before, on air and off air, I used to ruminate a lot and live in much regret. Um,
Right.
and so guilt was something that ate me up, like from a perspective of, like I mentioned to you before, for instance, let's say divorce, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because I was always trying to play through the events in my head. Even now sometimes I still suffer. It's about, again, a lack of acceptance with your present situation, the emotion you
Yeah.
feel right now and the circumstance, right? And so it's a real practice of emotional, conscious active decision making that has
Hmm.
allowed me to quieten the mind, reduce the anxiety, and therefore also, if I can practice that in my personal relationship, when it comes to working ones, I get 100 times better because there's not as much emotional depth, want of validation, all sorts of other things as there is sometimes with your partners, parents, and children and things like that. Not for
Yeah.
everyone. Some people are extremely bad in the workplace, right? But yeah, but I think, yeah, if people practice it more and more, the idea of
Let's flip that practice a
gone,
little bit to the other side,
gone,
and
please.
we let us use what you just said.
Yeah.
If someone is trying to use guilt against you to manipulate you or to make you feel down, which happens in the workplace as well as in family, right? Uh, what are some ways people should use what you just said about self acceptance and accepting the situation and so forth, so that they stay immune, not just immune, but even way more powerful than someone else who is trying guilt to change them or manipulate them? People do such stuff, isn't it?
Well, that's why I use the word practice because it is actually a pragmatic action, you know. So,
Mm.
small examples would be when people talk to one another, like you
Hmm.
mentioned before about sharing and safety, right? Um, a friend is going through a difficult situation in his marital life that's affecting his work and his career and everything else. In a barbecue, we're all laughing and joking as friends in a group. He's putting a mask on, right? But when he leaves and we're in the car
Hmm.
ride home, he has the opportunity to express himself and express those deeper emotions that are circling in thought patterns, right? So
In a
that one
safer
outlet,
situation. Mm.
exactly right. Then when you get
Mm.
better at doing that, you might also start having the confidence to just put it down on paper, journaling your thoughts, right? Not again, um, keeping the visual in your head. Put it on paper. See how, it's amazing from just a physics standpoint what it does for the
Yeah.
human mind and soul, right? It's just tried and tested, like I say. I don't understand why necessarily it works, but it does. I know as an actor, as a
I have a
performer.
reason. I have a one of the reasons why it works. There are many reasons, but one of the reasons is they say that the number of neurons in the brain is, of course, the highest, but the same amount of density is in few more places in the body. One is heart. Heart has a lot of neuron connections. Intestines have a huge number of neurons, which is why whenever we feel scared, we feel a gut feeling scared, and the number of nerve connections are way more. And the next place where there is a huge amount of nerves is the palm, the hand.
Wow.
We in fact, only humans have this opposable thumb, right? Even the
Yeah.
other primates don't have this, and this actually is the tool that makes humans hold on to things and so forth and problem solve. If you give the same problem to a dog, the dog, I mean, let's say for whatever reason the dog knows the solution, it doesn't have the hands to do the solution, correct? Because our hands are different.
You just made such a emphatic point there in a visual format for me.
Right.
Maybe I'm realizing now I'm a visual learner too, because kinesthetic problem solving or whatever else, right? I'm a visual learner too, because yeah, in essence, like you said, holding on,
Yeah. Hold.
wordsmith, right? You're holding a pen, and like you said, you're doing it with this opposable thumb. I only just thought from the process of like as an analogy, baggage, like, or
Yeah.
sometimes in like religious stories we'd be taught about like carrying stones. If you
Yeah.
imagine, the idea of carrying weight, basically,
Yeah.
isn't it,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Once you offload the weight, it will have a massive lightning effect to you, right? So in
Right.
the same sense, as you're speaking there, the idea of holding on and your hand being so kind of like central to this from a nerve standpoint, from a thought standpoint, from a sensory standpoint, I can imagine the action of just, letting go physically
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
thing that you're holding on to now in the format of words on a piece of paper. So
Yeah.
it makes sense to me in the scientific sense a little bit more now, even.
So on
But
the
yeah, I
on the
think those practices massively. But there's many
yeah.
more practices. I'm sure you could expound on, whereby um, it enables one to go from letting be to letting go.
So we got another interesting question, and this one I relate to myself. Okay. And I want to hear your opinion. Sometimes I feel guilty for talking about myself or praising myself, even talking about money or a good news. Why does that happen?
Um, yeah, this is an interesting one because coming from a spiritual background, I feel like I have to balance it always, even myself.
Yeah,
Um,
true.
and sometimes I'm not sure whether I am right or wrong in my emotion. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
but ultimately, I think it comes from that place of godly humility, or at least what
Mm-hmm.
some people have taught us in
Yeah.
terms of their opinion of what it is to be godly, right? The
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
idea that not to celebrate oneself,
Mm-hmm.
but to always minimize
Mm-hmm.
is the humble and right thing to do, right?
Mm-hmm.
But
Mm-hmm.
also, that's one aspect, it could be. Another thing, though, just generally, those who have been traumatized for whatever reason by positive attention. And it can happen
Mm-hmm.
in many, many different ways. Sometimes because you never received any positive attention.
Yeah.
Um, and so as a result, when someone does receive it, they really struggle with it. Sometimes you've received positive attention, but for some reason you don't feel good enough.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
They
you've
cannot
never
receive
ever,
it.
yes,
They
you've
cannot.
just never
Yeah.
ever been able to accept and
Mm.
receive that emotion being shared with you, right? Because you don't recognize it yourself, because you can't hold on to it for yourself or create it for yourself or
And
experience
not
it for
just
yourself.
recognize, but you might even feel unsafe because in the past, as a child, especially because of trauma, each time you have been happy and you say, "Hey, I got 1,000 pounds," or "I am a rich person," or "I'm a beautiful person," or "handsome person," or "I am wearing this," when people have done that, either whether it was school bullies or caretakers or parents or whichever way, someone else did not make them feel safe, and they say, you know what, if I uh, downgrade myself, or if I am the lower person, I'm talking about the non-spiritual side first, because spiritual side, there is another way to see the same situation. But let's say you are my caregiver, and I come and say, "Hey, I won the gold medal today," and so forth. And this actually happens in families where people say, "Do you know how much trouble I went through today, and I have no time to talk about your gold medal," or anything of that kind. Or and I mean, if it is a gold medal, still there is something, but if it is even smaller, things are minimized, right? You come and say, "I made a new friend," or let's say, I got a new chocolate or whatever," and the caregiver says, "So what? What the hell? Do you know what I'm going through today?" and so forth. They are trying to talk about their situation, not trying to. But as a child, what we have created as limited beliefs, especially going through various versions of trauma or reliving them, is, if I feel good, that's not safe. There is a background kind of thing. If I show off money, that's not safe. I'm not saying showing off money is good or bad. What I'm trying to say is, when you're trying to celebrate something, that has not been associated with something safe, right? So that's on the caregiver side of things, and which is why people stay in their familiar zone. But on the spiritual side, the original reason why it was meant by all sorts of religions is to minimize yourself, or to see the bigger divinity or the bigger godliness, etc., is so that we can recognize um, this wonderful creation in everywhere else, instead of us sitting on top of a mountain saying, "I'm the best," etc., etc. That was the original reason.
To reduce
And the,
arrogance, essentially, right?
yeah, yeah. And the real person, real in some spiritual sense, the real godliness is also inside us as well, because everything is that, right? It's everywhere. It's omnipotent and omnipresent and everything, which means it's us as well, right?
Yeah,
Everywhere. So which means we have to do our own self care as well. But yeah, I hope that answered the question for the first part, where sometimes people feel good in that familiar yet unsafe situation, but please do something about it. If you live like that, you're not loving your own self. I'm replying to the person who asked the question, that if I minimize myself, that's no way of saying that the person in front of me is better. The better way is to actually lift them, or live together. But minimizing oneself is lack
mhm,
of self love.
indeed. No, most definitely. And I think, yeah, to compromise oneself, like we said, it will just cause resentment, resending of that emotion, isn't it? Because you don't have an
Yeah,
outlet.
yeah.
So yeah, so whether it's letting it be and letting it go and having acceptance, or
I think
changing
that was a
behavior.
good, yeah. Um, Anything else before we close? I see you. Time flies. Look at that. Look at the clock.
Yeah, no, time always flies when you're having fun, right? So no, I think it's an interesting discussion, and one which I would like to see what the public has to say, right? Because these questions have stimulated the discussion today, somewhat. So yeah, I like these sessions where we get to
Definitely.
fire off the responses we've had. So yeah, so it's a great discussion.
And one thing I observed from today's session to take away is guilt is a nice indicator. So if there was no guilt, then people would be in a completely different situation, doing wrong things and never realizing what was the mistake, and it would hurt everybody. So guilt is a good indicator, but not a great place to stay. We should learn the lesson and move on.
I think that's a great way to end the show, sir. A great way to end the
Awesome.
show.
Coach Kanji, thank you so much again. And I think we have more questions today as well. And I love that interaction. And we look forward to the next week's session as well. Thank you again. And
Indeed,
thank you,
indeed.
everyone in the audience. Bye.